Say the emergence of civilization plunged our species into anarchy, and that anarchy inevitably means there will be a war of all against all. I am leaning on the English philosopher of anarchy, and he lived through a fair amount of it, of Thomas Hobbes. He may have been wrong about the state of nature, but he understood that the inevitable outcome of anarchy is a war of all against all. And we've seen that in our times in places where all order breaks down. There is no governing order and nothing to hold back any humans who are willing to do what they have to do to get power. There is inevitably a selective process so that what you end up with in these anarchic situations like Lebanon in the late 70s and Somalia in the early 90s is that there are these warlords with their followings that are fighting for control. The war of all against all is something that's borne out by the evidence. The war of all against all inevitably generates a selective process, meaning there's going to be a variety of options about how different ways of human society might be. And there's going to be a war of all against all that selects certain of those options and discards others. And the criterion is, how well can they do in a war of all against all? And at that point, I feel like I can say the emergence of civilization, where the interactions of the societies are ungoverned by any order like is true in the biological system, inevitably generates anarchy, which inevitably generates a war of all against all, which inevitably generates a selective process which says that only the ways of power can survive and spread. Power being defined as what it takes to do okay, to get by, to get a piece of the future, despite the fact that there is no order regulating the interactions among civilized societies, and thus there is anarchy, and thus there is a war of all against all. And only the ones that can do okay in that, which is quite non-random, have a piece of the human future, which means civilization will evolve in certain highly predictable ways. And I believe that it's been some years since I studied all this. That book came out 40 years ago, The Parable of the Tribes. But I think I remember well enough to say, when it comes to the spirit of the gangster that gets a disproportionate say on how civilization will survive, that you can pretty well see it in parallel ways in the half dozen places on this planet where civilization emerged, not transplanted from someplace else, but emerged sort of organically, not all together at the same time, but interestingly, when you look at the tens of thousands of years, why was it that civilization emerged in Mesoamerica and Peru, in the same ballpark as when it emerged in the Nile Valley, in the Tigris Euphrates, and the Indus Valley, and the Yellow River in China? Those are the places where I gather, if I still remember correctly, that's where civilization rose in this. And in every case, there's a selective process favoring what can survive and do well in a war of all against all. And what you do is you start in all those areas with a cluster of societies that are having to interact with each other outside of any order, and that's what's unprecedented. therefore an anarchy, and therefore a selective process starting to happen early on. Probably going from hunter-gatherer to gardener and herder, that was probably enough to unleash this war of all against all, or at least skirmish of all against all. But in any event, it appears that the process, which took maybe 5,000 years from the beginnings of leaving the niche in which we evolved biologically, inventing our own way of life, maybe 5,000 years, and we end up with these empires that look kind of the same, and they look like what you would expect to prevail in a war of all against all, like the warlords that you got to see in Somalia with these running around in jeeps with machine guns mounted. That's what we've been up against. A selective process that drives things in a direction that we would not have chosen, but we could not avoid. In that book, The Parable of the Tribes, the passage that was most quoted by reviewers at the time starts off with, imagine a group of tribes all living within reach of each other. I mean, there's going to be interaction, not governed by a naturally evolved order like the lions and the zebra in the grass. There's going to be interaction, and there's not going to be any order to contain it. And as there is interaction, let's imagine that for a while everybody chooses peace. If all choose peace, then all may live in peace. But what if all but one chooses peace, and that one is bent upon predation and expansion? I don't mean to say that this probably is how it happened, that there be some bad guy that is the gangster. But the system will be producing gangsters along the way. But this model, in a sense, sort of shows the irresistibility of this reality that there's going to be a selection for the ways of power. And it goes like this. What if all but one chooses peace, and that one is bent upon predation and expansion at the expense of its neighbors? And here the anthropologists say that civilization emerged in places where the potential land for them was somewhat circumscribed. So they were kind of bunched together in the Nile Valley or, some such place and didn't have a ready way of avoiding contact. What are the options for the other societies? Let's say we had 20 societies to begin with, all chose peace but one, 19 to 1, but what are the options for the other 19? Well, one is that the predator does what he has to do to be able to conquer a neighbor. And let's say he chooses to exterminate the neighbor, which is certainly something a lot of people have done in these ugly pages of human history. Well, and then he moves in, and he's got already a little bit of a growing empire because he's got his original territory and his neighbor's territory, and they're not in the way. And let's say he gets ambitious enough to try conquering another neighbor and succeeds because he's got whatever it takes to do that, to win in the war of all against all. But instead of exterminating, he decides that he can turn them into some kind of human livestock, just like they've had herds and of cattle, perhaps. So also do they now have herds of people. You can read about it in Exodus, but slavery was widespread among the empires of the ancient world. Well, so when the conqueror comes in, it changes that world in what ways that it's able to and that if it believes will serve its purposes. So its cultural ways will become part of that world, like the way in England when the Normans invaded from France into England, they brought a Romance language, and so our words for governing are from French, from Latin, whereas all of our words in English from daily life are from the Anglo-Saxon Germanic language. But in much more profound ways, the culture of the conquered, the vanquished people can be transformed and become more like, or at least in some way in the image of the conqueror. Like Native Americans might be compelled to live completely different lives under the Spanish boot in the Southwest, where I used to live. There's a place called Acoma. And there was resistance from the Native American men on this plateau. And the Spanish cut off a foot of every one of the men. And they turned the native house of worship into a Catholic church. These kinds of things happen all the time, and a lot of them have to do with things which have to do with the ways of power. I didn't say it a minute ago, but the ways of power mean every aspect of a society that bears upon how much power it has for the war of all against all is germane, and it includes virtually every dimension: economic, political, technological, psychological, cultural. All these things feed into the power of a society, and as the selective process eliminates the things that don't do well and selects for the future belonging to those that do well, it's simultaneously selecting for certain technologies like iron, say, at a certain point, for political structures like more centralized, therefore more able to command an army to work its will, and different ways of bringing up kids so that the young men are going to be fierce warriors or good warriors or whatever it takes. The selective process is going on for generation after generation after generation. It's not like a NCAA tournament, but inevitably, as some societies survive and some don't, and it's not random, gradually things take a shape that's got to do with power. So let's say the third option is that a society sees what's happening to its neighbors, the exterminated and the enslaved, and it says, let's get out of here. We don't want either of those fates, and we can't beat these guys on the battlefield. They're going to, they're powerful enough that we can't resist them. So let's go to some place where we're completely out of the system and we're out of reach. And that's why in say 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, when we're talking about primitive people, and the primitive meaning hunting gathering people, we're talking about people that are in most remote places, whether it's in the Arctic like the Inuit, or in the jungles of the Amazon, or the forest people in the Aturi forest in Africa. These are people who are where civilization hadn't yet reached, but of course civilization's pretty well reached everything by now. But the anthropologists went when the native cultures were still existent, even into this century in some places. So they leave to become inaccessible, run off into the mountains or the jungles or the Arctic. And the expanding empire of the one country, society that wasn't willing to have everybody live in peace, in this metaphor or model, sees that the territory has been vacated, and that too gets absorbed into the empire and settled, presumably, with colonists, as are the ones that get, all the others get settled by colonists too. Typically, that's how the Romans did it. And then there's the fourth way, which looks like it might be different, because this is one where the society is not going to be conquered. it decides it will defend itself. And the problem is, and the paradox of the thing is, to resist power, you need power. Again, this is a particular definition of power. And if the other society has developed power by certain kinds of innovations in any of those categories, that's going to increase the pressure on any society that wants to defend itself to find ways of also magnifying their power, maybe to imitate the way the Japanese, for example, in the late 19th century saw it was industrialized or be gobbled up by the rest. And that's where you can see this option. We're going to defend ourselves, and we're going to do it by becoming more like the West in our technology and in our economic system. And that worked fairly well until they awakened that slumbering giant in 1941. But they did beat the Russians, 1905. So there are in this fourth option, just like in the other three, the extermination, the absorption and transformation, the withdrawal and the filling the vacuum, and then in this emulation in order to match power. In all of those ways, the inevitable consequence is that the ways of power get spread through the system. So what began as, just this little bit, actually turns out to be, in this anarchic system, a contaminant. It's a kind of a rotten apple thing, or I'm not sure if I know what the rotten apple thing is. One rotten apple in a barrel will spoil the whole barrel full? Well, maybe that's true, but in any event, in this case, one society that's bent upon expanding its power, its power seeking, compels the whole system to evolve in the direction of the kind of power it takes to prevail in a war of all against all, a selection for the ways of power. It has some correspondence to meeting human needs. I mean, even if you're a beef cattle, you get fed. Even if you're a milk cow, you get fed. And even if you're an instrument of a system that's striving for power and not particularly interested in meeting human needs, you're going to get whatever the selective process will favor societies that are able to field a well-fed army or a well-equipped army or whatever all it takes. So it's not like they are direct opposites, but they're sufficiently opposed that you require people to become socialized in societies that are selected according to criteria that are often contrary to human needs. The needs of power and the needs of a human being, as we evolved, are going to be incompatible in some ways. And so if we're going to develop a fulfilling civilization, we need to find ways of ending this war of all against all, the selection for the ways of power, and healing the wounds that 10,000 years of selection for the ways of power have inflicted on humankind. From being the descendants of people who have been traumatized to being traumatized ourselves, to having to fit into civilized societies that are not as friendly to human nature as would be viable in a world that wasn't anarchic. Thank you. Please go to betterhumanstory.org to see all these things shown in a variety of ways if you're interested in seeing what the forces have been that have made the human experience what it's been since we made the breakthrough onto civilization and unleashed the destructive force that has driven our civilizations in a way that we did not choose but could not avoid, and put a battle between two forces, force of good and the force of evil, a life-serving force and a life-degrading force, at the center of the human drama, which just is an automatic component of becoming a civilization-creating creature because of the inevitability that I think I proved in a parable of the tribes over there.